in his commentary about how he sees the state, and also about this question that we said is the reason we're having this particular panel, which is what role for public investment and federal action, Fed action, in restoring growth? Is it an arena that we ought to look to from your perspective?
Absolutely. I think the argument that we heard this morning was very valuable and had many insights into our current situation and what the issues are when it comes to the vulnerable and restore our economy. Is very, very important, and we should continue to get insight into the long term and even the medium term effect of the current situations. The discussion about infrastructure, however, is more of a tactical nature of what you do in the implementation before you resolve the long-term issues of the world economy. And I think in that respect, the United States has done a very poor job. The increasing deficit of infrastructure investment in this country continues to have an extraordinary impact. The discussion about infrastructure investment has gone on for a very long time, but only recently has gotten into this because of the recognition that a highway roads have a terrible shape. The air traffic control system in this country is in terrible shape. We do not have a high-speed rail system that will take care of some of the problems coming through the carbon dissemination and the productivity loss of travel around the country, and so on and so on. But that's part of a larger argument that has to do with what does society do to keep its resources in good shape and competitive in the world. And we have not been doing a good job with respect to that. The other issue that one might raise is education and the rationalization or improvement of our healthcare system, and doing something about the impact of those now negative. They're not really negative, they're positive on whole. But from a competitive point of view, what do we do about bringing those investments up to a par? Bob Hormats, as some of you may know, called me from China last week. In the middle of the night, because he was so excited, he said,
just for the audience who's watching, Bob Hormats is the Vice Chairman of Global South.
Yes, he is the International National Global, a friend, and he called me as a friend. He said, the ride from Kennedy Airport, from Midtown to Kennedy Airport, as compared to the ride from the Chongqing, Beijing Airport to downtown Beijing, is really interesting to look. After comparing both, you wonder which is the third world nation. We have done a poor job, and it's not only in terms of the quality of life, it has done a very damaging impact to the productivity and the competitiveness of the United States in the global environment. I have a great deal of respect for the vulnerability, the discussion about the vulnerabilities of our planet. But I think it does not address, that discussion does not address what we have to do now, and we should have been doing for the last decade in terms of infrastructure investment. And apparently this is a conversation that is gaining more and more attention in the Congress and outside of Congress. People are beginning to realize that this is an idea whose time has come. When you hear the tremendous impact on the efficiency of air traffic control, you will want to take the railroad from now on. Because air traffic control continues to be not only inefficient, unproductive, it's becoming more and more dangerous. I'm not trying to alarm you, what I am saying is that when you recognize that we have not put any money into air traffic control or building runways over the last 15 to 20 years, but that air traffic will continue to grow at 5% a year, you recognize that this is a system that's not getting better. Why infrastructure? Why not investment in education, which we all know needs so much help in this country? Why not health insurance reform? The reason I personally single out infrastructure is because it is politically and financially doable now. I know there's a problem with education. I don't know what the solution is to education. And we do not have a consensus in this country of how to resolve that issue. And we will get. Eventually we'll recognize that we have to have a solution, even if it's only an incremental one, in order to lessen the momentum toward having a society in this country that's very much divided, we're going to have to do something like that. Why don't we address that first rather than infrastructure? My suggestion to you is that infrastructure is doable. A program that allows the United States government to jumpstart investments in infrastructure that would be done in partnership with financial institutions on Wall Street issuing 40 to 50-year bonds with a jumpstart from the United States government in terms of guarantee of 20% of the expenditure. This is certainly within the normal format of what financing structure has been forever in this country. And implemented by the private sector seems to be a mechanism that is not brand new. We're not inventing the wheel here. We're recognizing that this has worked before many, many times in our country's history. And take advantage of that, but we need federal leadership. This is not the first time that the United States has depended on executive leadership, the executive branch leadership, in order to help our infrastructure investments. Since 1803, the purchase of Louisiana Territory, two land grant colleges, the Transcontinental Railway, rural electrification, water resource control in this country, the federal government has taken the lead, and usually financially, and allowed the other elements such as the society, financial community, private sector, and local regions to manage to do the job. And finally, I would say that there is some recognition politically that this might be doable. This past session in the Senate, Senator Dodd and Senator Hagel introduced the Dodd-Hagel bill, which establishes a bank, an infrastructure bank, which allows for the issuing of credits, guarantees on the part of the United States, not outlays, but guarantees, a paper transaction, although it increases the debt, it really does not increase outlay. And it allows the investments to be made around the country to generate new jobs, more payroll. Earlier, one of the panel members said that it's folly to believe that an investment in infrastructure is going to pay for itself moving forward. I totally disagree with it. It depends what you're counting here. If you take into consideration the investment in human resources, in job creation, and new payrolls that are going to be by way of the new productivity and the new capital investment execution, the new job creation, those things will be very immediately felt. Within 1 or 2 years, you can manage that. So I would suggest that we have the opportunity to address this issue, and I'd be interested to know what the other panel members have to say about that.
You know, I want to go to Sherle next, but later something I want to think about, because Desmond raised this very interesting graph a moment ago about the capital crunch, credit crunch between banks lending to banks. And frankly, what it does is it limits your ability to get an echo effect or a multiplier out of financial activity. And one of the comments we had at dinner last night that Bernard shared is what the financial markets could do with government initiated efforts in certain areas and looking at the levels of multiplier you could get in a normal finance situation and how that fits. So I'm going to come back later to that. Let me invite Charles Schwenninger to offer his thoughts.
So thank you. Let me begin by complimenting Desmond for his very insightful presentation. I find it very useful. If you're a regular reader of the Financial Times, every 2 or 3 weeks you'll find some very valuable pearls of wisdom over usually in the letters columns, and usually they're signed by Desmond Lachman. I think I've learned more from this individual by reading the Financial Times letters, and I just wanted to have a public opportunity to express that gratitude for you. I think Bernard is on to something very important here, and I think where I want to pick up from Desmond's contribution was that while I agree with many of his important recommendations on monetary policy and getting out ahead of this credit crisis, which could take on additional dimensions that we have not seen yet, I believe also, however, that there has to be a fiscal policy response to complement it. Particularly in terms of complementing it in terms of the impact on the real economy, and to avoid repeating some of the mistakes we have repeated in the past, where we've used asymmetrical monetary easing, which only created another distortion in investment by creating another asset bubble. In fact, I think the silver lining of this particular crisis, if you can find a silver lining, and there's a lot of pain and damage and a lot of worry about the contractionary effects that this will create and the impact it will have on lives of millions of Americans and indeed perhaps throughout the world, is that it's a necessary correction to what had become a bubble economy in which too much money was going into housing. U.S. economic growth was too dependent on housing and consumption related to the wealth effects of housing. U.S. consumption, in turn, was too much responsible for driving the world economy, or the world economy, world economic growth, which depended on U.S. economic growth, as demonstrated by the increase of the U.S. current account deficit, even in Zach's world, where these things national borders don't matter as much. And so the world was too dependent on U.S. consumption that was built on both debt financing and asset inflation. This allows us, this adjustment, if we're smart about it, if we have the right policy, allows us to move the economy on actually a more optimal and sustainable path, a more balanced path of economic growth for the future, one that is built on more capital investment, both public and private, where wage and income growth drive consumption as much as the wealth effects of assets, and where we have better balance globally, where rising living standards in emerging economies and increasing consumption help drive demand for U.S. goods and services. So we should see this, through all the pain, we should see this also as an opportunity, much in the way I think Jamie Galto wanted initially. Now, my basic point is that if we are now beginning to see the first positive leg of the adjustment, I think, in the U.S. in the increase in U.S. exports, which, as David Hale pointed out, have grown 14% in each of the last 2 or 3 months, and has contributed net demand and net growth to the U.S. economy, largely offsetting the fall off in housing. Interestingly, the weaker dollar, which is helped in this regard, I think will have actually another longer-term beneficial effect if it plays out with regard to some adjustment in the exchange rate to the Asian surplus economies as well. Because what will happen is that this will force, a weaker dollar will force the Asian exporters to cut their profit margins, which means that prices to the U.S. consumer will not increase all that much. But it also means that the excess savings that Martin Wolf, I think one of Martin Wolf's most of the Financial Times, interesting contributions to this debate, has shown that the Eurasia savings has originated from enormous corporate savings, corporate profits in Japan and China. So in some ways, this reduces the producer's power in China and Japan, elevates the consumer powers, and hopefully can stimulate the trends for greater consumption in those economies, which will increase demand for U.S. goods and services. Turning more to domestic macroeconomic policy, again, my basic point is that we need to have a fiscal policy that complements a monetary policy, partly for the reasons the previous panel said. There will be limitations to how effective monetary policy is, particularly in restoring investment, when corporations already enjoy historically low interest rates and are sitting on tons of cash. It will help some consumers, hopefully by reducing some of the interest rate charges, but there will be limitations as important as the Fed's targeted efforts to to unclog the credit and capital markets and perhaps even help recapitalize parts of the financial system. There'll be limitations of lower interest rates generally in order to stimulate the real economy. And even if it does, again, the worry is that if you have a one-legged or one-armed macroeconomic response, we get an unbalanced response in turn. Therefore, I think fiscal policy has to play a role, particularly a role in after bursting of an asset bubble, to restore demand and to restore demand and investment. Now, with regard to fiscal policy, we should not allow this to be an opportunity for the supply side right to put out a new round of tax cuts, which are already doing in some respects. We should use it to make a much more sound case that the best fiscal policy would be an increase in public investment spending, particularly beginning with public infrastructure spending, for three reasons. First, it's the best way to both crowd in investment and demand at the same time, which helps with the economy recover, that helps stimulate investment. It creates jobs and income growth, therefore helping us put us on that path to a more optimal economic growth. And third, and most importantly, it can be targeted. Now, while the housing, bursting of the housing bubble is going to have these generalized effects, if you noticed the map, the initial map of our presenter on the map, there are certain regions, high area regions, where you will have cascading effects and therefore depressing economic effects in local and community housing markets where you have a large number of foreclosures. And the report of Global Insight for the Association of Mayors identified many of those areas. And Jamie Galbraith, I think, explained very well how this cascading effect could happen. One way of offsetting that is with targeted public infrastructure investment projects that could go in and increase demand for local housing, increase jobs, restore government revenue, etc.
Thank you very much. Joel Kotkin.
I mean, actually, I think there's some really surprisingly optimistic things. I was mentioning to Sherle that when I've written several pieces about infrastructure and places like the Wall Street Journal, the most positive response was not where I thought it would come, which would be so-called liberals, but actually from conservatives. That I actually think that in the broad middle and even on the right, there are many people at the grassroots level who would really support a back-to-basics public policy. They don't like the way we're spending public money, but they understand the need for roads, some of the things that Bernard was talking about, some changes in education. They just want it to be very much based and centered on the fundamentals. And I think one of the reasons for that is that we have to start thinking about the future, and I'm going to just talk a little bit about the longer term. The United States, and I know this bothers some people to talk about, the United States is the only advanced industrial country with relatively healthy demographics, i.e. we're still having children. My friend Bill Fry from Brookings was speaking in Japan, and he said, he was showing the numbers, the U.S. is considerably higher birth rate than the Japanese audience. Said, I don't understand, how do you have more children? And I said, if that's the question you're asking, you've got more problems than I thought. But the long term is that in Western Europe and Japan, Korea, in the next 20 or 30 years, we'll be looking at about 30 to 35% of the population being over 65. The U.S. will be about 15 to 20%. So we have this next generation, which could be an enormous source of strength for the United States as we compete with the various wheelchair societies. The problem is, are we ready to make that investment for our children, which our parents, and particularly the generation of my grandparents, were willing to make for their future? That's where I think it's a big question. Clearly, the things Bernard is talking about, the roads, the congestion, I have to say very often I'm driving along the 5 freeway of Los Angeles, which is the leading industrial center of North America, and you're going along the 5, and you really think you're in a third world country. I mean, it is just, the roads are literally falling apart. and there are places that are even worse. On the education issue, I would link these a little bit, but in a different way. I don't think we have a problem with PhDs, and certainly not PhDs in English. What we're missing is basic skills. When I speak around the country, and this happened in Milwaukee on Wednesday, the biggest problem they talk about is basic skills. Welders, machinists, plumbers. We're not even creating the skills. And I'm particularly concerned, frankly, about the young men who are not going to college anymore, because the men are going much less than women, and have no real path of upward mobility at all. An infrastructure program would provide some opportunities, and an expanded export sector would provide some opportunities for those people. And then, of course, there's also the tech infrastructure, and anyone who's been to Australia or Korea knows that our broadband system is not exactly second to none. Bernard mentioned the fact that we have this model, and having done a lot of studies of history of the United States, is actually quite good at this. This whole idea that we've always been this laissez-faire society. There have been aspects of the laissez-faire society, but we've actually invested heavily in turnpikes, canals. The financing mechanisms have been all over the place. They've been state, they've been local, they've been private, they've been federal. The railroads, of course, that was a lot through land grants. There was a tremendous growth of what some of us affectionately like to call sewer socialism. Milwaukee being a famous case of that, where we invested in the basic infrastructure. Basically, as my friend, the former mayor of Houston, Bonnier, says, the job of the public sector is to provide the pathway for private business to travel. We sort of don't do that anymore. The public sector isn't involved or concerned or focused on that issue. We did it with the interstate highways, the National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, and of course DARPA, and which led to the internet. Now, what are we doing now? We're not doing enough. We're not doing close to enough. I do think there's a bipartisan nature to this support. I do think that a lot of people in the middle of the country, who maybe some of the people here in Washington think are some sort of lower form of life, but actually they're very aware of the fact that the roads aren't good and the airports are crowded and the kids aren't getting the basic skills. So I think there is a lot of support. I think there's also a growing fear in this country that if we don't address this situation, both by job creation, by building up the manufacturing base, and providing basic skills for both office workers and the factory and the warehouse sector, we will continue to have this increasingly bifurcated society where the people at the very top aren't affected by it. People who can take helicopters don't have to worry about traffic jams. And so I think that there is a lot of concern about those things on the national level. Cities, which of course somewhat my specialty, I see where cities are investing money in convention centers and arts palaces, the subsidizing of hip, cool condos in downtown. By the way, that's going to be a huge catastrophe on the real estate front. Nobody's talking about it because who's going to spend $700,000 for a condo in downtown St. Louis if they don't think they can flip it? I think there's this whole Disneyfication of the inner city. Meanwhile, the job growth has been falling off. I think is a big problem. We have extreme cases of this, and I talked a little bit about it at Cleveland. You had discussed Cleveland's back. Well, they put the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which is beginning to fall apart. They can't even get the stars to show up at the induction, so they have to do it in New York. And Cleveland, of course, has one of the highest percentages of poor people in the United States. New Orleans, if that isn't something that proves that not investing in infrastructure can really screw you up. And yet they had plenty of money to build all sorts of convention center and other sort of ephemeral things, and it didn't exactly work very well. And Bernard would know from New York, the roads, the subways. I invite anyone to get the number 7 train through Astoria and into Queens. I'm doing a project on the future of the New York middle class, and it really does feel somewhat like something you would expect to see in India. It's just creaking, and you're just waiting for it to plummet over. And in my home state of California, or adopted home state of California, we used to spend 20% in the 1960s of our budget on infrastructure. We now spend 3%. And we're increasingly a very creaking economy that's increasingly bifurcated, and we're really living off the background, the 35 years ago. So in terms of the future, I think there is a growing consensus. I think once you get behind the supply side ideologues and some of the people who are the Democratic side who are born again budget balance first people, I think once you get around that, I think you'll find there's a lot of support for this. People understand, particularly in the recession, this creates jobs and opportunities. I think this emphasis would also help us begin to move, as my friends in North Dakota say, we need more machinists and less poets. I think we have to have increasingly a focus on the emerging middle and working class populations. What's going to happen particularly to the children of immigrants, those who are not going to go out and get PhDs from Harvard? What kind of life are they going to have? What kind of jobs are they going to do? So it's not just brain or brawn, it's really being able to do both. So basically, I think that what we're looking at is the need for a major reform on the level that we've done historically in the past. It's not anti-American to have a public investment agenda. It is really what has made America what it is still today and what it needs to be in the future.
Thank you very much, Joel. Janet Kavinoky, besides her responsibilities with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, directing their transportation infrastructure activities, is also head of a labor business coalition called Americans for Transportation Mobility. She's been thinking about this. As I said earlier, Tom Donahue, the president of the Chamber, has really been very active, and I think it's a very important event looking at this fundamental issue as well. So Janet, welcome.
Great, thank you for having me. I think the first thing I want to say is we have to recognize that the U.S. still has the best infrastructure in the world. We have spent years of our history as our demographics have evolved, our economy has evolved, our country has grown, building that infrastructure. I think now one of the significant problems we have is that the pace of change of our economy is rapid. It's amazing to me. I sat yesterday in a session where people were describing to me how I should go dig my blogs, and I realized I'm still fairly young and I didn't know what it meant to dig a blog, and now I know just how fast things are moving. And yet the pace in which we plan and execute our infrastructure is glacial. So where the U.S. Chamber falls out on these things is frankly that we really are looking at a potential economic crisis because you have an economy that's growing even modestly at 2 or 3% a year. The capacity of our infrastructure is not growing at all. Now, granted, for a long time we had overcapacity in our roads, we had plenty of capacity in our air traffic control system, so things sailed along. And there were much other sexier things to put money into. It's always sexier to plant trees or to take care of education or anything. I always tell people anything where you can look at kids, you can look at cats and dogs and trees. Your great visuals will motivate people. They'll say, we can invest in these things, we're going to see benefits, isn't that wonderful? It tugs at your heartstrings. And frankly, asphalt does not tug at heartstrings unless you're somebody like me who happens to really love infrastructure. So what's happened over time is we have underinvested in the maintenance of our existing infrastructure, and I think that's what you're seeing today in the road systems, in the transit systems, in New York, across the country, even in air traffic control systems, and all the while we've also neglected maintenance just so we can kind of keep things going and fill the potholes instead of really rebuilding what we need. We also have done some building of new projects. Very popular for members of Congress to go cut ribbons on new projects, but we have increasingly lacked a prioritization of where infrastructure dollars are being invested. We have started spreading the peanut butter. If you look at the Federal Aid Highway Program, which I think is a good example of this, instead of being about investing in strategic assets, like in 1956, when the Federal Aid Highway Program was created to build the interstate system and had a very specific purpose, we now collect user fees, gas taxes, from people who drive, and then we spread it out across the country as thinly as possible. And instead of investing in strategic assets, the debate in Washington, at least about federal dollars, and I think I've seen it a lot at the state level, is can I get back what I put in? instead of, are we actually invested where we need to invest? I think in order to change this, there has to be an economic imperative. There also has to be a quality of life imperative, and those two things are linked. We have a public that is increasingly tolerant of delays and of congestion, and not necessarily demanding a lot of change. I've heard some people talk about it as the frog in boiling water sort of example of this. Instead of outrage about the fact that someone's commute is now an hour longer than it used to be, instead of outrage about having to drive in LA 2.5 hours to get from my brother's house in Lancaster, Palmdale down to LAX, people say, you know what, I'll just use my time better. And so they eat, put on some makeup, maybe they change clothes, we've actually seen pictures of this. They make phone calls, they use the internet. They say, you know what, I don't know if we can do anything about this. There is a pessimism, I think, about, well, it's just the way things are, it's just the way the congestion is, and we can't handle it. People sit on runways. Now, I think the air traffic control situation might be a little bit different because you're in a confined space with a lot of other people and you can't do all of those things and just pass the time, and then it gets really hot, and then you can't go to the bathroom, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we have an incredible tolerance right now as a public for just letting things go. And we'd much rather have instant gratification. I thought that the discussion this morning about the iPhone economy was very, very interesting. I said to some people last night, you know, we're in a place now where people would rather go out and buy on their credit card a great flat screen TV than they would replace their roof when the roof needs replacing. They'll go put a bucket under the leak and then they'll go watch their flat screen TV. Well, I think we've done a lot of that with infrastructure. Here's where the problem comes in. We are the frog in that boiling water when it comes to, in particular, goods movement in this country. You have the 5 major sectors that make up the economy: agriculture and natural resources, retail, manufacturing, transportation itself as a sector of that economy, that make up 84% of the economy, and they all rely on the efficient, reliable, cost-effective movement of goods. Agriculture and natural resources in particular, because of what they're selling and the commoditization of that, really rely on being able to get things out of this country to the rest of the world in an efficient way to be competitive. I don't think you're going to see a massive crisis along the scales that we talked about this morning in housing and in the credit markets, but what you will see is an eroding of the competitive advantage that business has been able to get through working around our infrastructure limitations. The fact that we've been able to create a logistics system and supply chain management that say, okay, well, we know this is what infrastructure is, we're just going to work around it, has allowed us to virtually increase capacity. Well, at some point, that capacity is going to be the be-all, end-all of retarding that growth, holding those companies back. And in fact, the Chamber has just entered into a partnership with the RAND Corporation and their Supply Chain Policy Center and asked them to start looking at capacity at critical points in our transportation system, at ports, at borders, at the elements of our infrastructure that are really relied upon for an economic growth, and to tell us if there's a D-Day out there, so that we can really hold that up to Congress and say, look, this is an economic issue. I think that what Joel has talked about is absolutely right, and this is certainly along the lines of what the Chamber is about. And we have to talk about, as a business community, the need for this country to maintain a commitment to the fundamentals. I think we've got to do that in 4 ways if we're going to lead towards change. Bernard, I happen to disagree with you. I think there isn't a widespread understanding of the need that's out there. People know that infrastructure is important, but they're not compelled to do anything about it. And so what we have to do is do the research, do the education we need to do to make sure people understand the need, to make sure there is that groundswell in the grassroots, so that Congress will actually take some action. Because we all understand, I think, what's going on. And we can call, and I, as the Chamber's chief lobbyist on transportation, can certainly go in and talk to members of Congress. We need to do something. We need to do something about air traffic control systems, waterways, we have to do something about roads, but it doesn't make a difference if their constituents don't call. Right now, their constituents aren't picking up the phone. We also have to, I think, we do have to encourage private investment in infrastructure. Not just in roads and rails, but waterways. We have to look at the energy crisis that we have in this country. We have to look at the communications problems that are going to keep us competitive. And I think the next thing that we have to do is it really comes down to dollars and cents. And the Chamber is committed to facilitating a dialogue on where we're going to get the public investment from so that we can move forward addressing these issues and I think help the economy generally, help the regional economies that really drive this country.
Great. Thank you, Janet. We're not going to go to all of the people, but I did want to give Desmond an opportunity to just share any thoughts or concerns he has about whether there is a place for a fiscal approach given the picture you helped paint at the forefront of this panel.
Yeah, thank you. I think that there certainly is a role for fiscal policy. You know, Fiscal, I have nothing against fiscal policy, and in fact, I recall that in reaction to the bursting of the earlier bubble, when we had the NASDAQ bubble bursting in 2001, part of the solution was a very large easing in monetary policy, but it was also accompanied by an easing on the fiscal policy side. My memory serves me correctly, we started from a surplus situation that was 2 percentage points of GDP. We moved to a deficit of 2 percentage points of GDP. My concern right now about fiscal policy is that for whatever reason, we've squandered the ability to use fiscal policy in an aggressive way to deal with what's a serious problem. We're starting from a deficit situation right now. The deficit's bound to widen as the economy weakens. And more importantly, I'd say, is that the ticking time bomb of Social Security being bust and the Medicare being bust doesn't afford the United States the luxury of really stimulating the economy at a time of need with fiscal policies to the degree that we would. I would just add that my experience of busts is what we're talking about in the housing market is we're talking about losses in wealth. And what is going to go on in society is a debate as to how that wealth is, and how those losses are spread around. My experience tells me, much as I don't like it, is that the taxpayer is going to be picking up that bill too. And the kind of numbers we're talking about aren't small. So in short, I think that there's not the room for fiscal policy. I'm not saying that you can't do anything about fiscal policy, but really where the solution to softening the blow of this bust, in my view, is really going to come from monetary policy, in the simple sense about pumping a lot of liquidity into the system, and the more important part is making sure that the financial system works properly. I'll just make one other point. I don't think I've given sufficiently pessimistic a view of the world. One point that I'm really concerned about is that if you look at the history of the last 5 years or so, that the two economies that were really providing support to the global economy were the United States and perhaps China. What is my concern right now is that as the dollar weakens, what needs to occur is that the rest of the world, that the countries like Japan and Europe, need to be following and providing the aggregate demand that is going to be subtracted from the United States. And the signals that one gets, when one hears the ECB talking in much the same way as I imagine the Bundesbank would have talked, that the only thing that they can really focus on is the fact that inflation in the past is at 2.5%, doesn't give me much hope that we're going to be preventing this turning into somewhat of a global storm.
We do know that you have your optimistic moments. I would like to, but we've got just a little bit of time, so let me get some questions on the table and then we can respond together with this.
I just wanted to, actually, the movement in the government deficit was much larger than that. The 2000 recession, and Martin Wolf contributed 7%. So in fact, we went from a surplus of 1 to 2% to close to a deficit of 5 to 6%, which suggests by that experience that, in effect, we should be thinking about using fiscal policy proactively in any case, because the deficit is going to increase in any case. So making wise use of fiscal policy that will help prepare the ground for recovery would be a better use of it rather than having a long period of suboptimal economic growth, which would put us in a worse position for fiscal expenditures in the future.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Bill Greer.
Thank you. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer. Just a couple of observations and then a question. One observation is that because of public infrastructure investment, about more than 50% of Japan's coastline is now concrete. Another observation is that every time it rains in Washington, millions of gallons of raw sewage go into our rivers, and you haven't discussed the sewage disposal problem, which I think is a huge infrastructural problem.
We talk about sewer socialism
in the United States. And of course, if you observe our metro, it is tremendously lacking in simple preventive maintenance over the years. The rails are getting wobbly and what have you, and that shouldn't happen. It doesn't happen in Japan, I might add. But my question is, all of the infrastructure suggestions that have been made lend themselves to be described as pork. And I mean, infrastructure over the years in Japan, or certainly here, a lot of it can be described as pork. What mechanism would you put in place to prioritize and reduce or render the pork into something more palatable?
Right. This is the bridges to nowhere point, which I think is very important. Joe, why don't you respond and then Gavin, real quickly.
Joe's looking at me.
But I'm gonna beg for brevity.
I think first of all, pork is in some cases in part a creation of the media. And after the last surface transportation bill was passed, because of the existence of the bridge to nowhere, people were led to believe that that entire bill, all $286.4 billion of it, was a bunch of bridges to nowhere. Now, I will tell you, that bridge to nowhere has become the burden of every transportation professional's existence, because we now have to fight this perception throughout the country that every time Congress passes one of these bills and it has a specific project in it, it's pork. There are certainly a certain number of those projects that I think we could argue whether they have federal investment or not. I do think some of what Congress has already put in place with transparency requirements is very, very helpful, but the bottom line as we pass these bills is we have to have a strong national imperative about infrastructure and a goal. A lot of people talk right now about we need a new vision for transportation policy, and I'm really tired of hearing about the new vision. What we need is something that's very specific that ties the investments we're making with benefits, so people understand if you spend X on this, if you invest X, we're going to get Y. We had an interstate system that had that federal aid highway program very, very focused for years. As the interstate system grew near completion, it was like, wow, we're collecting this money, so we're going to spread it out, we're going to spread it out, we're going to spread it out. We need to stop spreading the peanut butter and start prioritizing. I think then you will be able to distinguish the pork from what the real priorities are.
Again, good comment.
There's just one specific thing that I, just from looking at certain policies, take a look at transit. A lot of the federal government says, well, we'll give you money to build a light rail system. Now, you may not need it, may not be the right solution, but what we did in, one good thing that we did in California, at least in Los Angeles, is we said, give us the money and we'll spend it on a system that makes much more sense, which was what's called bus rapid transit. We're able to get the same effect for about a third of the price. So I think sometimes if the federal government would say, we're going to give you X for mass transit, this region, and you spend it the way that makes the most sense. Now, not that the regions will always make the right decision, but right now they're consistently making the wrong decision because the federal government says, we'll pay for X, but we won't pay for Y. I think it has to be up to the regions, and then if the regions screw up, well, that's their problem. But I think that so I can't tell you how many times I've talked to people and said, well, how come you built this, this system which carries no people, basically? These empty trains, you see them in St. Louis and Atlanta with, 80% of the time they're empty. He said, well, the federal government mandated that if we're going to take the money, it had to be spent this way. Different regions have different needs, and I think there should be more discretion given by the federal government, and I think that would at least take care of some of those problems.
Thank you. I'm going to take one last quick question because I'm running into a time infrastructure challenge myself, and several of our speakers need to move. But one last question, yes, Alan Gifford.
Thank you. It seems to me that
It's going to be a brief question.
yes, it's very brief. Sprawl is a big reason that our infrastructure costs have gone up quite a lot. A number of cities have lost population, and yet there's substantially more driving, and that leads to a lot of congestion. I want to know if anyone has any insights on how to tie investments to location decisions so that businesses and homes are located in ways that are conducive to serving them efficiently with our infrastructure investments.
Thank you. Good question on sprawl. I know this is Joel's favorite topic, so.
It's not my favorite topic. I think that a lot of this discussion is, first of all, cities are losing population because they're unsafe and the schools stink and they have terrible business climates. That's why people leave. I think if you decide that one of the great theories is, well, we won't build any more roads and then people will be forced to live in the inner city. We're going to green people in the little boxes, but that's what the new urbanists and the Greens want us to live in, but they don't want to live that way. But what you find actually is probably more the case is once it becomes impossible to get into the central city by car, in most parts of the country, there are some countries like New York, but then people just stop going. You look at the 1970s where the price of energy went way up, we didn't get a return to the city. We actually got more sprawl because it took so long to get into town. If you, so I think if you really, the other thing about the whole question of sprawl, people who live in the outside of Ted Glazer and Harvard's done great studies on this, they actually drive less and spend less time getting to work than the people who live in closer in. The longest commutes in America, by the way, are in New York and Chicago. Much worse than they are in Los Angeles, which may be somewhat of a surprise and most media would probably realize. So I think the issue is how do you build the appropriate infrastructure in the right places? And I agree that we should try to bring the jobs to where the people live, but urban leaders are going to have to face the fact that if we do that, many more jobs will be in the suburbs than will be in the cities. Already, that's where the population is, and where 92% of the growth in metropolitan areas has taken place since 2000.
Thank you. Recently, I had the privilege of having a breakfast meeting with a few other people, with Nancy Pelosi, and I asked her about Bernard's efforts to focus on public infrastructure issues in a whole variety of points. And without getting into the questions of prognostication about where the economy is going, there is, I think, if you read Bernard Schwartz's paper and Schwenninger's paper, which again, for the C-SPAN audience, we will have on our website in the link, is that there are reasons to reinvent the country and sort of look at this. And I asked her where she was on this, and she says she totally supports it. She supports moving into a capital budgeting approach, but she's still in favor of pay-go. And just in terms of concluding this, before I invite Steve Coll, the president of the American Nation, to come offer just a quick concluding end to this, let me ask Bernard specifically, where do you see the tectonic dimension to this going politically? And do you sense that the tension between pay-go and thinking about public infrastructure investment is something to be overcome?
Pay-go is a Republican invention that was adopted by the Democrats, and by adopting that from a political point of view, the Democrats have painted themselves into a corner. It means that you can't have any new initiative, irrespective of how valuable it is to your society and your constituency. You can't do it unless it's revenue neutral, meaning cut out some other worthwhile project or raise taxes, and that's just the politically kind of good thing to do today. I think the question that's raised, what do you do with that? Okay, so we agree that we need this. for any number of all good reasons we've heard. You really need a political will to do this. This is not an economic problem, nor is it an affordability problem. I agree with many of the things you put up, but I come up with a different conclusion. For example, I look at the Social Security crisis that was 4 years ago, something that was imminent on our doorsteps and something we would not be able to handle. If you add to the pension liabilities that are unreported, etc., as really a fiction of what happens in development. The fact is, Social Security has been amended 30 times since, and it's probably the most successful social program we've ever had in order to take care of better requirements. Not only that, calculus is so important. When you think in terms of a businessman buying a machine that he needs, and it costs whatever it costs, but it's going to be amortized over 10 years, and he gets 18 years out of use of that machine, he thinks he's got a dividend for 8 years. The federal government, or rather the rhetoric here, says that a person, the human machine, who is calculated to be productive for 65, if he happens to work, he or she, to 75 or 80, that's a bad thing. What isn't a bad thing? The fact is, it helps ameliorate the Social Security problem and builds our society very well. So the calculus here is very important. So, what do you need? You need a political will. All you need here are leaders who are going to say, we need this, like we need good drinking water, it's something we're going to have, like we need an army, like we need an initiative on a national level for whatever the reason is. We need it. And we have the capability to pay for it and the smarts to make sure that we don't build 3,000 bridges that go nowhere. If you look at a program like the Bridge to Nowhere and other like problems, wasteful problems, it probably represents 2 or 3% of the capital budget that was spent and authorized that year. Will you tell me which one of you operates at 98% efficiency? And the perfect year is the enemy of the good. If we allow the investment in Bridge to Nowhere to defeat us, to immobilize us for doing what we have to do to keep us a constructive, competitive society, we're going to lose out at the end. It will be our fault. And the historians will look back and say, look what those people were doing 30 years ago. We have to act now. You have to motivate your representatives to do something about it. With all due respect, the media has to understand that writing good things and affordable things about our society may not sell as many newspapers or web hits as bad news, but it's equally available for us if we're going to reach out.
Thank you. Let me invite well-known of the New Yorker and the Washington Post, now President of the American Foundation, Steve Coll, to say a few closing words. Thank you.
At New America, we try to consider and where appropriate, pursue the unorthodox. That usually doesn't extend to offering welcoming remarks when it's time to say goodbye, but I apologize. I was at 7:15 circling above Syracuse in the Air Canada jet, and unlike the problem that Janet highlighted, I was not suffering from a deficit of outrage about the wait for an air traffic control vector on the East Coast. But I'm very glad to have been here throughout this morning. I learned quite a lot. I hope you did as well. I just wanted, in saying goodbye, to emphasize that this event is not a one-off or isolated body of work for us, but part of a continuing body of work that includes 2 things I just wanted to mention by way of inviting your continued participation and involvement. One is New America has a very important California presence. A laboratory of democracy is about to become a laboratory of the credit crisis. Our office in Sacramento is a very short drive from vast empty housing stock. And in Los Angeles, the rates of reset and default in the next 6 or 12 months are likely to be acute. And the California state government is going to wrestle very early on with some of the policy formulations, possibilities, and debates that occurred in the first panel. Those of you who are researching and involved in this, I'd urge you to look to California and New America to be helpful to you. Please take advantage of this. The second thing I wanted to mention is that another important body of work that New America is engaged in now flies under the banner of the next social contract, which is an attempt to synthesize our work in domestic policy and to wrestle with the obligations of the public and private sectors. And there's an important event on Monday, December 3rd at the Mayflower between 9 and 3. And you're all welcome to come and register in the morning. I think you'd find it as valuable as this. And then finally, I'd just like to thank everybody, my colleagues in America, who worked so hard to put this on. Samir in particular, and Patrick Doherty and Sam Sherle R. But if this morning was valuable, and panelists, of course, but I've been told I've been seeing it 25 years, and the earlier panel, they were just terrific. But if this was valuable to you at all, it was because of the extraordinary efforts of one person who worked unbelievably hard to make this successful, and that was our moderator, Steve Coll. So I'd like to end this by thanking him. Thank you.